This episode is brought in part by David Eggleston, a generous Patreon supporter.
Carry me back to old Virginia. Carry me back to old Virginia.
Jamestown, and on a broader scale, Virginia, were saved by a shipwreck on islands believed to be inhabited by devils. From tragedy came life. In a poignant way, this is how much of Virginia's story takes place as well. If the men, women, and children didn't believe in God before they boarded the 9 ships heading to Jamestown, they surely would never forget him after the journey. There was only one official Anglican minister on the voyage, Richard Buck, though there were other religious groups represented, such as the Puritans, who added an interesting dynamic to the colony in coming decades. England's literary circle was also represented on this journey in the person of William Strachey, who counted John Donne and Ben Jonson among his circle of friends. He himself was a poet, but to this point in his life, Strachey only had debt to show for his name. That being the case, Strachey decided to try his luck in the New World, and escape his creditors in the process. He would ultimately fail there as well, but his legacy was ensured by the records he kept. Matchumps and Namontack also accompanied the large fleet as they were ready to return home from their long educational English tour. They had much to tell Powhatan, which would influence the great chieftain in the coming years. Also, Virginia's economic savior was on board, John Rolfe. He was accompanied by his pregnant first wife in joining the mission's ranks, though she would never know how profoundly her husband would affect the colony. Once everything and everyone was loaded and accounted for, Reverend Buck prayed over the fleet, and the first 7 ships began their journey on May 15, 1609. They would need Buck's prayers. They would need everyone's prayers. They would need God's mercy. Some received that mercy by an early death, though others received it by surviving certain death. The fleet moved toward southern England, where they would meet 2 more vessels at Plymouth. It was here that Thomas Gates and George Somers, the veteran sailor, joined the expedition. They waited in port for 2 weeks while the remaining provisions were loaded, and Thomas Gates arrived with the newest revised charter governing the venture's mission. Gates' arrival, however, didn't help calm the eagerly awaiting would-be colonists. The charter did dictate that Gates would be the governor in Delaware's place until Delaware arrived. But while at sea, George Somers was the admiral of the fleet. Thus, he was in charge until the company put foot in the land. The slighted odd man out in this new situation was Christopher Newport, who was demoted to vice admiral. But he wouldn't go away quietly. He was the veteran Virginian captain, so he wanted to impose some clout of his own. All 3 men jockeyed with one another for position in spite of the company's commands. All 3 men therefore couldn't trust one another and had to keep the others in view. So all 3 faithfully boarded George Somers' flagship, the Sea Venture. It was arrogant insolence in perhaps all regards, save George Somers, who had a right to captain his own ship at the head of his own fleet. But their foolish choice almost cost the colony, as it certainly altered history. Finally, after every provision was loaded, the fleet of 9 set sail once again on June 2, 1609. But unfavorable sailing winds forced them back into port at Falmouth until June 8th. The delays were costly, costing the venture considerably in time and provisions, thus a decision had to be made. Continue on the northern path to Virginia through the West Indies, or sail a new course directly westward as pioneered by Samuel Argall. If the group fell upon difficulty and were separated, they'd meet at a pre-planned location, Barbuda in the Caribbean. Otherwise, they'd have to meet at the Isle of Devils, as veteran sailors called the Spooky Island. Apparently, as the many exaggerated stories went, the place was inhabited by evil demons who loved to feast on shipwrecked bodies and souls. Making the decision was bold and dangerous. The route would take the 9 ships across more than 3,500 miles of open ocean, with no other port option than perhaps Bermuda. But if the ships didn't arrive at Jamestown in a timely manner, then the colony would suffer extinction. They had to take the chance. 7 weeks of easy sailing saw the fleet rapidly make way toward Virginia. So far, so good, especially when one compares the voyage against the 4 months that it took other expeditions to sail to Virginia. But this trip was different than others in that so many people were crammed in the 9-vessel fleet. Many of that mass were seasick for the first few weeks. Summer heat exacerbated illness, especially as a reeking stench plagued those below decks. Animals, their feces, and human waste certainly added to the foul conditions. Rations also began to spoil in the fetid air, and other illnesses such as scurvy began to show on the ocean-weary passengers. Further, boredom raised tensions amid the seemingly endless miles upon miles of water. Eventually, people started to go mad with fright, due in large part to visibly seeing more than 30 dead bodies thrown overboard from across the fleet. Rumors that disease was breaking out spread faster than any disease could affect passengers. One such rumor had it that the Diamond, one of the ships, was inflicted by the plague. A certain possibility, because London was suffering in the throes of a plague outbreak at the time. Further, rats were ever present aboard the suffering ship. With so much mortifying potential mixed with endless boredom, it's easy to see why the fleet began to suffer mental unrest. But boredom wouldn't last. The fleet was sailing through the mid-Atlantic in July, certainly under what present-day weathermen term a Bermuda high. It was hot. Direct sunlight was plentiful, and light winds meant that the conditions were perfect for an Atlantic monster to form. And one did. Veteran crews began seeing towering thunderclouds across the horizon in late July. They also noticed that the sea began to swell rhythmically. Heavy rains unleashed sporadic downpours, perhaps a momentarily welcomed relief from the intense July heat. Then the humidity roared back, thickened to the putrid air below decks, and heat re-intensified. By July 25th, calm conditions had seemed to return. Pleasant winds cooled the fleet, and the mariners worked rapidly to take advantage of the favorable weather. They were soon speeding rapidly, for that time, through the Atlantic. As the day progressed, however, so too did the wind. With stronger winds came increasingly intense seas. Swells began to turn choppy, and whitecaps soon cluttered the ocean, and the crew began growing nervous. According to Gabriel Archer, who was on his return voyage to Jamestown, they believed that they were about 150 leagues from the West Indies, and crossing the Gulf of Bahama. He and others were well off in their predictions. They were much closer to Bermuda than they were the Bahamas, as they'd soon find out. In the early afternoon of July 25th, the crew quickly realized that their worst fears were indeed true. The cause for the winds and waves was seen in a massive black cloud that covered their western horizon. A hurricane. The ship's crew sprang back to life as the storm ominously approached the fleet. Sails were tied down, passengers were brought below decks, provisions were secured. All the while, lightning flashed across the sky, and thunder cracked as the winds intensified, and they whipped the seas into an ever-increasing fury. The ships tried to distance themselves from one another so as not to be dashed against each other. The Sea Venture, which was dragging a pinnace loaded with 20 souls, cut the line that kept the vessel close by. The storm quickly obliged and took the small bark and destroyed all lives on board. Within a few hours, hurricane-force winds were being consistently felt throughout the fleet. 20-foot swells punished the 8 remaining ships, which began taking on water. Then day turned to night. William Strachey, who stunningly had time and wits enough to write, said that the storm beat all light from heaven, which like a hell of darkness turned black upon us, so much the more fuller the horror, as in such cases horror and fear used to overrun the troubled and overmastered senses of all. The only thing worse than a hurricane was a hurricane at night. The elements minus daylight plagued the passengers, who could not sleep amidst the fury. Crying and screaming filled the air, but the portentous wind drowned the noises out. The only one seemingly hearing anything was God, who listened to the panicked, heaving prayers flying to heaven on rapidly moving lips. For the moment, however, it seemed as if God increased the storm's fury. Strachey noted that the wind spoke more loudly and grew more tumultuous and malignant. In the meantime, the ship's crews directly contrasted the prayers being offered below decks by singing and cursing at the storm. In their minds, it was bad luck to pray during a storm. Either way, the storm's fury began taking a toll on the crew as well. Ships rocked so violently that no one could stand amidst the pitching and rolling. Water washed over decks and into the ships at a ferocious pace. Raindrops became pellets under the wind's guidance. Everyone was soaked. Those below deck had the added torture of being thrown into walls, cannons, provisions, loosened debris, and other passengers. For at least 24 hours, the fleet suffered the hurricane's fury, and then calm returned as the skies suddenly cleared. The passengers were so overcome with emotion that crying was the normal sound heard in the air while everyone was checking their newly acquired cuts and bruises. Hugging and praising God for his deliverance followed, but soon that gave way. They had not yet survived the storm. They hadn't even endured the worst of it yet. They were only in the storm's eye. Within a relatively short period of time, the storm-bedraggled survivors of the hurricane's first round were in what we now call the right front quadrant, the worst part of any hurricane. Strachey and his fellow passengers, however, believed that they were in a second, more intense storm. It was more terrible, more constant, more furious, and more outrageous than the first. New fears were added to the former, but this time, the passengers and crew were already wearied from the first round. 2 straight tempestuous days pushed the crew beyond all humanly possible limits. They toiled to keep their ships afloat, but it might all be for naught, because at any moment a giant swell was expected, such a swell that would dash the small wooden structures into tiny pieces. All of the remaining 8 ships suffered under such conditions, but from what little we know, the Sea Venture, the ship carrying the 3 most prominent men on this mission, struggled the most. Strachey, who was also aboard the Sea Venture, tells us that the storm's tossing opened the ship's seams and water began pouring through the hull. 5 feet of water quickly filled the now sinking flagship, as fear swept through as quickly as the water entered in. Carpenters searched for leaks, patched what they believed to be the only sources, but water still seeped in. In the meantime, dredging brigades were assembled by all present, as they worked numbly and mechanically through weariness and pain. But water overtook them as well. The Sea Venture was sinking. After 18 hours of panic-stricken toil, all seemed lost, especially as passengers and crew gave themselves up to fate. Perhaps they were too weary to notice, or maybe they were too distraught to care, but they had survived the hurricane's most lethal fury. They were in calm waters once again. Those who regained their severely frayed wits noticed that they were all alone now, as the other ships were tossed all over the middle Atlantic, perhaps never to be seen from again. Summers, Newport, and Gates realized that the Sea Venture, however, was still in no shape to sail to Virginia. They weren't even sure if the ship would survive the day, so their best hope was to find the rest of the fleet, but they found nothing. Nothing was the same thing found by scouring the ship for leaks. They patched everything they could find, then they ran out of caulking materials and had to use slabs of dried beef to fill whatever leaks they could find. The ship's pumps also failed because other loosened food, biscuits, and hardtack had been picked up by the rising waters and found their way into the overworked pumps. That being the case, the already wearied hurricane survivors had to reassemble their bailing out brigade just to stay afloat. But the many days' events after a long journey were proving to be too much. People began giving up as Summers did his best to rouse spirits, but it wasn't enough. The Sea Venture began listing and could capsize at any moment. Thomas Gates stepped in at this moment and organized the 140 men aboard the ship into rotating work gangs that would work an hour at a time and recover for an hour while not working. This action saved the flagging ship for another 3 days. As the men continued toiling beyond their limits, a strange round light, like a far-off star, appeared on the ship's masts and danced as it sparkled. It stunned the fascinated men into silence. Sometimes the fire would show for 3 or 4 hours and then disappear, but it would always come back just before morning light. No one quite knew what to make of the phenomenon that we today call St. Elmo's fire. Superstitions abounded about the meteorological event, but Strachey's rational wit tells us that no matter what was said about the strange glow, the reality was the Sea Venture was drifting to her death. It seemed as if nothing were working. Summers believed that about 100 tons of water was pumped out of the ship every 4 hours or so, but water was still slowly rising. He had to lighten the ship, which was done by throwing provisions overboard first, then cutting and sending the non-essential ship parts into the ocean. And finally, the mainmast was discussed, which would have consigned their fates. In front of that discussion, the crew gave up, opened the ship's alcohol store, and drank themselves silly. It was over. 4 solid days after such stormy horror had done everyone in. But just as those aboard were saying their goodbyes, Captain Summers enthusiastically bellowed, "Land!" Those who had given up now roused themselves one last time. They passionately threw water out of the Sea Venture, hoping to make it toward the land Summers had seen. Soundings were taken. 13 fathoms. 7 fathoms. 4 fathoms. But jagged reefs were starting to appear. There was no place to safely drop anchor. Nor would it matter if anchor were dropped. Therefore, Summers ordered his crew to run aground as close to land as possible. This being done, the Sea Venture came to rest between 2 reefs about a mile from shore. The maneuver worked. They would not all drown. Every one of the 150 passengers, as well as the mastiff and several hogs, were ferried off the tattered ship and brought safely to shore. But the pink sand beaches of land frightened the newly saved souls just as much as the howling winds had done in recent days, for they were now beached on the Isle of Devils, where demons would feast upon their wearied, worn souls. As we shall see, Bermuda proved to be anything but an island full of devils. It was paradise. A paradise that the survivors would soon work hard to exchange for the hell Jamestown had to offer. Thank you for your continued support of the Virginia History Podcast. Help spread the word. Share the podcast. Also, subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast provider, such as iTunes, Stitcher, or Podbay. Don't hesitate to write a review on iTunes. Doing so greatly helps raise the podcast profile. Like us on Facebook and visit the website at vahistorypodcast.com. Please also consider contributing to the podcast Patreon campaign in order to fund future research and episodes. Visit the campaign at patreon.com/vahispod. One can also find a link under the support tab on the website. Another support option is the podcast store, where at present I am actively expanding a print library. So perhaps you are not able to support the podcast on a monthly Patreon basis, but single purchases can be done. Links will also be in the show notes page. Thank you so much to those who have provided me with valuable feedback. It's all greatly appreciated, and please, I encourage you to keep it coming. And join me next time as we look at the Sea Venture's time in Bermuda, as well as her shipwreck's impact upon Jamestown.
Oh, Papa, do do do